Hello, once again, and welcome to Fuel for Thought, your weekly look at all things energy related, gas, oil, and otherwise. And also, we dip our toe into the political world. That's why it's Fuel for Thought. I'm Scott Squires, joined as per usual by the insider Dan McTagg. And Dan, a couple things definitely want to get to chat about today. But first things first, as we record this on a Friday, prices would have been set by utility boards in the Atlantic region yesterday and today. But overall, what are you seeing in markets for gas, oil, home heating fuel? Because we've certainly in the Atlantic region, we've been seeing an upward trend.
You have, and this week it crested. It seems to have come back a little bit. I had predicted for Newfoundland about a day or so before that prices for gasoline would drop about 2.5 cents a liter, and diesel would be down about five and a half, along with home heating fuel. And that it turned out to be spot on and correct. There's some times of the year where regulators use the proper methodologies, which I use all the time for the rest of North America. And when they do that, they tend to harmonize with what I predict. So, and no, unlike some people out there who get these little predictions the day before, I'm not getting it directly from the regulator. I do it because it's all done based on calculations that you and I know go back some 30 to 40 years. So, this is the market. I only reflect what's happening in the market. If there's any deviation, it's because bureaucrats have tried to create a synthetic type of, regime for which people are, user regulated prices like a security blanket. It's not. You're basically being denied what the price movement is 2 days in advance. But that's okay. People don't mind being ripped off, I guess, if they don't recognize it. But I can't fight that anymore. I'm not going to be bothered with it. Your regulation is a dumb idea, and it's an idea whose time has come and gone. It might have been great in the 70s and 80s. When there were concerns about independent gas retailers and when you didn't have predictability, when no one looked at the markets. But I do and have been doing it for quite some time, and remarkably accurate when it comes to reflecting what's happening in markets. And so I think this is probably the last week. We're going to probably see prices move up a little bit. Again, the big question is what happens to all prices for everything, including commodities like energy, when the Trump tariffs are as expected hit Saturday, February the 1st. When that happens, of course, it's anyone's guess as to where we go. Simply put, we could see prices move up, or we could see them move down. Move up because, of course, Canadian dollar will fall in value, as it already has this week. And we price all of our commodities in U.S. terms. So, at 28 cents a liter is what it costs you because of the Canadian dollar not staying on par with the U.S. greenback. That could be easily 31 cents a liter this time next week. At the same time, if oil gets sanctioned, then or is subject to tariff, we're not selling enough of it. That means we could see a drop in energy prices. So one may balance off the other. One thing's very clear: Americans may get a bit of a hit, but because they have a strong U.S. dollar, they're going to get it. They're not going to be affected by this in the way Canadians will.
You just referenced the loonie and the value of it, and you posted something yesterday saying that the value of the loonie, the Canadian dollar, is at its lowest level since March 19th of 2020. And that was just when we were in the beginning stages of the pandemic, when basically the world shut down. What does that mean, Dan, for Canada, its buying power, and for consumers?
Means the investment has shrunk and has disappeared in Canada. No one wants to buy any Canadian products. And even before the tariffs take place, we're already in a situation where our currency is quite anemic compared to the U.S. greenback. Now, some will say, well, it's not so bad with other nations. That doesn't matter. 70% of your trade is done with the United States. It does matter. And it matters even more so, more grievously, if the United States proceeds with a tariff and our counter, whatever our counter should be. One thing is very clear: the loonie is going to not just be limping, it's going to be pretty much cut off at the knees, and we're going to continue to see it decline. There's a number of ways the Bank of Canada can defend that. Yes, higher interest rates, but the other one is to buy Canadian currency, which it can do by exchanging other currencies that it holds. That's something we saw in the 90s. It's something we saw in the 80s, but it's extremely unique to our time. What you have now in Canada with a 145.1, I'm looking at the markets right now, 145.2 cents to buy a US dollar is a reflection, a significant reflection, not just of affordability, which I've been talking about for years, but the Canadians have endorsed policies that have hurt the economy. No one wants to invest in Canada, not even in real estate. So with all of that gone, all you got left is borrowing money. How much money do we have to borrow before the banks and lenders finally tell us, no, your credit worthiness falls to pieces. I think that's going to happen in the next couple of weeks.
No matter what you think of the current US administration and the inner circle around that, there's no denying the power and the strength of the United States, certainly as a trading partner with Canada. And, I've seen many posts talking about how it's just not a good idea to get into a trade war with the United States, a country that we share a massive border with and that we have a massive amount of trade with. I'll call upon your experience, Dan, as an 18-year member of parliament and your decades in and around the political arena. What would your advice be right now, given the fact that these tariffs look like they are coming in and, we could be on the precipice of a trade war with the United States? What would your advice be, Dan McTagg, if you were still the MP and you had influence?
There are three areas that we have to focus on, or we are going to continue to have this tariff war. The first, of course, is the easy one, migration. You've allowed your country to be an open, porous border that allows any Tom, Dick, or Harry to come in here. And they usually have, there's some of them, a handful of them, maybe nefarious types, who've made their way to the United States, and they've been apprehended, thankfully, before they could do some harm. But if Canada's going to be trendy and cute and bringing all sorts of people around the world, as it has done for the past 10 years, then there are consequences for that. The second is the proliferation of gangs tied to drug cartels. Now, we've had Sam Cooper, who've talked about this for quite some time, about casinos being used as money laundering. These are gangs, are Sinaloa, Jalisco gangs from Mexico. There's South American gangs here. There are Chinese triads and gangs that are here. There are Russian gangs that are here. There are, in fact, IRGC and Iranian Revolutionary Guard gangs that are here too. We said we sanctioned these people. We didn't really sanction them. We deported one or two, and that was it. The fact is that we have a fentanyl problem in this country, not just of use, which in of itself is concerning, but of production. And we are being seen as sort of a soft target by which these products aren't just made as in terms of labs here in Canada, but they're also sent to the United States. And while we are cracking down on them of late, let's face it, Donald Trump had not come into power, our same catch and release program and easy on these products and this production of nefarious products by gangs would have continued. So, Canada has basically taken a sort of relax, let's have free drugs and nonsense like that. Look, this is what's caused the problem and created caused the ire of a new sheriff in town. And from 2020 to 2024, we may have ridiculed the Republicans and, of course, Donald Trump. But there's a new order in town. From 2025 to 2029, you have to deal with a government that's very committed to cracking down on criminality. As a member of parliament, I remember this being a concern for Americans back in 2000. I got in a lot of trouble for it. I'm not going to back off. Canada wants to be considered and think of itself as lily white and that these things don't happen. Think again. The Americans have different information. We have different information. Now, of course, in Canada, we have things like the Hogue Inquiry and others that basically try to minimize and whitewash what's happened. But our partners aren't going to do that anymore. Yeah, Canadians can be sold a bill of goods on how nice they are and how everything's just fine, but the rest of the world doesn't find it that way. And Americans are finally calling us on our laziness, our sloppiness, and our trendiness.
And that's two of the fronts. What's the third?
Well, the other one, of course, yeah, thank you. The other one that has of grave concern to Americans is dairy and marketing boards. These are boards that basically have seen us dump milk, have protected a certain constituency, and Americans have had enough of it. That's not fair trade. It's actually a form of an older form of the planning system under the Soviet era. And this is, although it may, benefit some of those who have these licenses in supply management, it's now on the trading table. And the longer we continue that, the longer it's going to, the more difficult the tariffs may be. And they may actually be more than 25%, especially on agricultural products. So I don't know how this is going to work out. But I think those who still have their minds left in the mentality of the planned economies of the 1940s better get their head out of that sand very quickly, because it's now going to affect every single Canadian, regardless of where you stand on these issues.
Dan, I remember decades ago, a little something called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And it was heralded as being something that was going to benefit all three countries involved, Canada, the United States, and Mexico. I don't know that I've heard NAFTA mentioned in a long time. What happened to NAFTA? Where is it?
Well, it was replaced by the USMDCA, so that was the agreement that was concluded in 2019, 2020, near the end of the Trump era. It went for 7 years, so it's coming up for renewal next year. I think that has a lot to do with why we're seeing these comments from Trump. They are really trade based. Now, of course, let's deal with Trump because this is the art of the deal stuff. This is how he operates. Throw a grenade into a room, get everybody in a panic, and then come back with a deal. Obviously you go to the extreme to get what you actually wanted, which is somewhere in between. And I think we have to be mindful of that, but we have to be factual about what's happened. And I think that's clear in terms of our trade. We need a government that has a mandate, the legitimacy to conclude such a deal with any country, much less the United States. And right now, Canada and Canadians lack that legitimacy. Whether or not they've made mistakes, not once, not twice, but 3 times, but electing this government, I'll leave that aside. The reality is that this government has no moral or political authority to conclude any type of treaty or deal, regardless of whether Jagmeet Singh decides to get on board one day and make all sorts of promises that he's going to bring down the government or not. It is time for this government to seek the public's approval for the road ahead. And right now, it doesn't have that. Therefore, the Americans look at this and say, yeah, you can have all the agreements you want, but in 9 months, there'll be a new government. That can't happen soon enough, by the way.
And you mentioned new government, which leads me to think of Mark Carney. By all accounts, he is being passed the baton rather than it really being any kind of leadership race. Even some of his own um, insiders who may have thought about running against him are now basically saying that Mr. Carney, Mark Carney, is basically going to be anointed. And he's come out actually today, I believe, and in essence has said that he will, if elected, he will scrap the Justin Trudeau carbon tax. On the surface, that might cause celebration amongst businesses and certainly Canadian consumers. Dan, you know Mr. Carney's policies and his history very well. What's he really saying when he says he's going to scrap Justin Trudeau's carbon tax if elected?
Mark Carney, the outsider? No, the insider. For the past 4 years, he's run the economic affairs of this government, and he is nothing more than and nothing less than Justin Trudeau 2.0. Mark Carney is not going to scrap anything. What he's going to do is basically switch it around to maybe impose it on businesses, on manufacturers and industry. That will only cause them to say, hey, we're out of business, bye-bye, or pass it on to consumers. You're going to pay for this one for another. Mark Carney's on record as saying he wants $200 a ton or more for carbon taxes, which means add not only the additional 18, 19 cents a liter you're going to be paying for gasoline, by the way, if the Liberals do manage to hold on till 2030, you're going to be paying probably another 10 cents above that. And you don't seem to mind. Plus, Mr. Carney is very much, the bag man for trying to get organizations around the world to stymie our oil and gas sector. Talk to Tim Houston, the premier of Nova Scotia, who rightly pointed out the other day, hey, listen, we need a pipeline here. It's too bad we don't have one. We could tell the Americans that it's not so easy to have tariffs on a product we can sell to someone else. We don't have that now. We don't have the jobs that go with it. We don't have the economic opportunity that goes with it or the investments coming from globally that would invest in this. Instead, we have Mark Carney, who basically said, don't build Canadian pipelines. Put it in Brazil. Put it in the Middle East. This man is an economic vandal, and I would say by any account will be soon seen as a traitor. He's a one-term wonder, one term as a leader. Once his party is reduced to rubble, to less than 50 seats, he'll pack up and leave and go on to the next mission that the United Nations or the World Economic Forum demand that he come. But I think the worst thing is that Mark Carney, and I've written about this, Canadians for Affordable Energy, Mark Carney would be the worst thing for the Canadian economy. And if you want to double down on stupidity, no wonder he's getting support. These Liberals have not been able to change. They're still the same, green infused cult, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, ESG, all this other nonsense that didn't work 10 years ago. And now our ship is run on the shoals of a reef that they cannot get off of, and you want more of that. Look, Mark, Scott, I don't want to say this, disparagingly. Out in my garage, I've got several drills, a lot of bits. I just want Canadians who want to vote for Mark Carney to tell me what size of drill bit they want so they can drill another hole in their head. We've made big mistakes. Let's not, and we don't have the luxury of making another one. It's over, and the worst person we could have to run this country would be Mark Carney. If he does win, I got several months of great work ahead of me where I can expose for Canadians how silly it would be to support him once again.
On the front of giving the benefit of the doubt, Dan, let's say that I'm a supporter of Mark Carney and him being the Liberal leader and coming in as Prime Minister. And I say to you, you know, Dan, he's learned a lot and he's never been Prime Minister. So, you know, him being prime minister, he may reevaluate things and really look at things to want to help Canadians. I believe that Mr. Carney has business acumen, that he knows economics, and that he is going to be the best thing for Canada, not only internally, but globally on the world stage. You know, I really believe in Mr. Carney. I think that he can turn over a new leaf and be something other than he's been. What would you say to me?
Say, don't be a fool. You thought the same thing of Justin Trudeau, but most importantly, Mr. Carney has a mission and an agenda, and the record for him is very clear. Excuse me. He has been very much involved with the net zero mission of undermining economies like Canada's, particularly. He'd be the last person I would think is qualified or capable. Not only that, he doesn't have the common touch. He's never sat down with people. He can't relate to people on Main Street. And most importantly, his policies have actually injured the ability for Canadians to make ends meet. So if anybody thinks that that's cool and trendy and that's a great thing to do, think about it next time you can't make your mortgage payment, you can't meet rent, you can't buy enough to cover the food bills, or you've had to cut back. You've had to cut back in a nation that's blessed with an abundance of resources because people like Mark Carney are going out saying Canada should be ashamed of itself for selling these resources. I say to the Mark Carneys and the supporters of this world, move on. The country has had enough of your experimentation. We are a growing, prosperous, resource-based economy. If you don't like that, then I suggest you go to one of those countries where you might have a little bit more, people might have a little bit more interest. It won't be the United States. It certainly won't be Britain, where, of course, you left them with a massive debt, having printed so much money when you were governor of the Bank of Canada. And by the way, don't take credit for what happened in 2008, 2009, because we avoided that global crisis because we had a stronger economy. Thankfully, because of people like Paul Martin Jr., Jean Chrétien, and of course, David Dodge, the real central banker who knew exactly how to keep bad investments out of Canada.
And we'll talk about one last thing before we wrap up with you here today, Dan. You know, you talk about Canadians not being able to make ends meet. And it's been rumored the last few days that the current government is looking at a massive pandemic level economic stimulus, basically like the CERB, handing out money to Canadians, to businesses to help absorb the potential blow of American tariffs. I don't understand with a $62.5 billion deficit just recently announced in the economic statement how this could happen. But Dan, what do you make of this when you hear again about the government talking potentially about tons of money being handed out to businesses and Canadians to help absorb the blow of US tariffs? Your
Talk
thoughts?
is cheap. You haven't got the money. You basically blew away your fiscal position. As you know, that $62 billion deficit that you referred to, $1.3 trillion in debt. And the Bank of Canada has still got about $250 billion on the books, that money that it had to borrow, and it can't print money. Otherwise, it would value the currency. We haven't got a position to play here. There is no money to do that. And if government does plan to do that, look for major credit downgrades, look for interest rates to reverse, because the economy will start to look a little bit more like Argentina pre-Milei, and of course, be in a situation where our standard of living will continue to deteriorate. There's only so much, unless there's an attempt to try to bring about universal basic income and control people and control their lives, which has been the Liberal agenda for quite some time. It's all about control and authoritarianism. That's why you haven't had a parliament open since September. Think about it. It's January going into February. We haven't had a functional parliament in 6 months. What is this, a crisis? A world war? No. It is incompetence because we have an authoritarian group of people who believe they can spend with abandon and they can act with impunity and maintain the authoritarianism. I guess maybe Trudeau was right. He did in fact admire the Chinese basic dictatorship, because we now have something very analogous to it here in Canada.
Dan, we know anything can happen in the arena of politics. That's for sure. You think something's going one way one day, and the next day, reversal of fortune, reversal of direction. But I'll ask you this before we do wrap up with you, because I know you got a busy day. But using your spidey sense, your parliamentarian sense, someone that's been there, been in the back rooms, been in the privy councils, had the discussions, if you're reading the tea leaves, what do you see happening over the next few weeks and months with the Liberal leadership, a potential election call, and how Mr. Polyev and the Conservatives handle what's going on and to keep the momentum? Again, I know that's a lot, but looking at the tea leaves, Dan, using your experience and again, parliamentary spidey sense, what what do you see happening?
Well, Trump's tariffs may not be the shock that many are expecting. They may be over several months. That'll give us a bit of time. But the Liberals will use that along with the NDP to try to close down Parliament or at least keep governing for another year and a half using emergency measures. Now, we've heard emergency measures before, and a lot of Canadians' ears perk up when they hear that. I have no doubt in my mind that they'll use every tool that they have available to be able to support them, maintain themselves. One thing they cannot do is come back to Parliament for a vote. Although I think Jagmeet Singh, sellout Singh as we call him, has basically vacillated so often he ought to get in the Vaseline business because frankly no one trusts any position that he takes or that of the NDP. At the end of the day, the Liberals are going to try to maintain power. They're going to try to keep Mark Carney in there unelected and without a seat as long as they can, because they can't go to the polls generally, and they can't go to a by-election anywhere unless we're talking about some brain-dead riding in Canada where Liberals are automatically elected because people don't really think before they put their X beside a name. Nevertheless, I think what's going to happen is we're going to have an election one way or another by June, and that will see a whole new government with a whole new day and a whole new sense of reality. Like it or not, folks, we need a change, and that would be, in my view, the true great reset, not what Mark Carney and his other pretenders who destroyed the country over the past years have been pushing.
Dan, we certainly appreciate your time here on Fuel for Thought each and every week. But you're involved in a lot of other fronts, certainly Canadians for Affordable Energy being one of them. When you're not here with us and people aren't watching and listening to you here, where else can they find you and engage?
AffordableEnergy.ca is the website, and email president@affordableenergy.ca. And of course, on Twitter, I tend to use that as my main platform. I don't use LinkedIn. I don't use Facebook. It's just too much to do. But X is probably gas price wizard is the easiest one to find me at. Do engage there. I have about 60,000 followers. So there's a lot of opportunity for discussion. I learn, but I also provide what I know over the past few years to give people a sense of what's going to happen. And not just in terms of gasoline prices, but in terms of my experience on the Hill in the private sector in banking, automotive, and housing.
Well, Dan, again, we appreciate your time. I don't know if it's as cold in Ontario as it is here in Nova Scotia currently, but if it is, stay warm, enjoy your weekend, and we'll look forward to connecting with you again next week.
We'll see you next week, Scott. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure as always. Thank you, Dan.